absolutely amazing character. I'll give you a citation, the biography of him, if you're interested. He fought in the American Civil War. He fought in the Mexican Revolution on the Republican side. He fought in the U.S. Army against Indians. He became a Baptist preacher. He went to Cincinnati and went to law school. I mean, he did all sorts of things. And in the late 1890s, he became a journalist. And he went to travel to Europe. And Huntington, C.H. Huntington of the Huntington Library fame and of the Union Pacific fame, had a small investment in the Congo, and Williams managed to get Huntington to support his trip to the Congo, and to Africa. So here sets off this brilliant black American on a trip of Africa. Before he goes, in fact, he'd been in Europe once before he goes, he went to see King Leopold, and he thought King Leopold was just great. He did. He says he's pleasant and entertaining conversationalist, bright, quick eyes, flash with intelligent concern. The king told me, he says, what I do there is done as a Christian to the poor Africans, and I do not wish to have 1 franc back of all the money I expanded. At the end of the article that Williams wrote in his own journal, his own newspaper, Leopold is one of the noblest sovereigns in the world, an emperor whose highest ambition is to serve the cause of Christian civilization and to promote the best interests of his subjects. So you can see a little bit why this notion of the civilizing mission and doing well by the Africans and get rid of slavery convinces a guy like Williams. It could convince those with more cynical interest in believing Leopold. So Williams goes to the Congo. After goes to the Congo, and what he sees is what you read about. Right? And again, I want you to notice the form of this. It's specific indictments. It talks about how the treaty was made. It talks about inadequate policing. It talks about slave conditions. It talks about labor. Right? It's point after point after point, specifically documenting saying this is what you guys have done. It was a sensation. Again, notice its connection to the form of the humanitarian narrative and the way it's like Morel. It reflects, this text does, it seems to be 2 things. One, the horrors that you've actually seen. I mean, he witnessed these things that you saw pictures of, not in black and white, but in real life and in color with all the smells. And he was duped. I mean, he was a man who misread this King Leopold. So he produces this book, which has a huge influence on Morel, and on Casement, and on the Congo Reform Association. Well, so the end of the story is that in 1904, a Congo Reform Association is created with these people as activists and others, and the idea is to pressure Britain in the first instance and the rest of Europe more generally to break the hold of Leopold on the Congo. And in 1908, that in fact happens. So the Belgian Congo, which is a state that became independent in the 1950s, is the Congo that came under the sovereignty of Belgium and away from Leopold in this period. It was explicitly not Belgian when the European powers made it. It was his. So, in that sense, then, it was now to be governed by international rules rather than by the whims of an absolute monarch. And these most horrible abuses actually did end. On the other hand, the imperial depredations did not end, and the post-colonial Congo has been a disaster in some measure as a consequence of much of what happened there in the next 70 years, which is not our story, like 60 years. So let me conclude then with 3 points to you, okay? If you haven't read this George Washington Williams, you should. It's really great. Both of these are great texts, so catch up on this. We sent a B-Space announcement yet that you don't have to read the one article for next week? You're going to get a little less reading for next week. We're going to have a very short law article rather than a long history article. So it's a break. Let me just give you three conclusions. So the first conclusion, the first thing I tried to tell you, and that was the early part of the lecture, was this idea of the globalization of a particular historical vision. And it's this globalization that we still struggle with, and it's the globalization of which human rights discourse is a part. The second is the creation of of a venue, in some sense, if you want, of a structural logic of human rights abuse in this imperial context, which was sort of, in some sense, this particular domination and subjugation of civilized and not civilized is structured to violate the kind of universal claims that we've been talking about. But at the same time, and that's why I wanted to end with these three writers. At the same time, this imperial enterprise produces an oppositional anti-imperialist, and what we think of as human rights discourse. So out of this imperial project comes the kind of journalistic and literary output, which is now the sort of mainstay of what we take to be, human rights activism. It also is the creation of the organizations of civil society, like the Congo Reform Society, which exist to pressure governments to act in the interest of what we would call human rights complaints, to act against crimes of humanity. In other words, the imperial enterprise, at the same time as it creates a situation of impossibility, if you will, of this universalism, it also produces the possibility of a kind of the liberatory or redemptive side of this universalism, the kind of work that these people represent and that you see continually represented in the world today. So thank you. And the next lecture on women's rights is going to take up some of these features in a very particular context with the law school class. Have a great weekend, and I'll see. Someone's going to run for coffee? Run, whoever's going to have coffee with me.